Thanks, Herb, and thank you, everybody, for coming here today. It's a great pleasure to be here. And yeah, I didn't take much persuading, I have to say. I'd like to thank the organizers for putting together a great event. And when I got the call saying, you know, we're having this event, we'll fly you into Amsterdam, we'll start in the afternoon, we'll have a couple of sessions on Hadoop, and then we'll end up in a brewery. It didn't take me too long to decide to say yes to that. And, you know, if this Hadoop thing doesn't work out, you know, you've already halfway there in terms of organizing a stag do, so perhaps that's another business you could look at. So who am I and what am I going to be talking about? I'm Matt Aslett, as Herb said. I am Research Director for Data Management and Analytics for 451 Research, and you can see some of my other information there. 451 Research is an industry analyst company focused particularly on IT innovation. And as you can see here, we've got around 700 company subscribers, just over 10 times that amount in terms of individual subscribers, and also quite importantly, in kind of double that amount in terms of you know, enterprise IT users who are members of our network of enterprises that we speak to. So as I say, we focus particularly on IT innovation, emerging technologies, emerging markets, and so we've been following Hadoop for many years, and I think we're perhaps earlier than some other companies, analyst companies, in terms of picking up on the potential here. 451 Research is part of the larger 451 Group, and you know, you'll often hear both names used, but 451 Group, just to clarify, is the overall company, also owns Uptime Institute, and as of January, or I think it was early February this year, we also acquired Yankee Group, another industry analyst company, based over in Boston, with a focus on telecommunications. And so, you know, that's who I am, that's who we are. And in terms of what I'm going to be talking about in this session, I'm really talking about what is the point of Hadoop, which might seem like a strange question to ask, given we've got 500 people here who already have a kind of an interest in Hadoop. But I think it's an important thing to consider, and I think it's definitely a key question that we see being considered by later adopters. You know, Hadoop's greatest asset, I think, in some ways, is its flexibility. It can be used for many different use cases. It can be used in many different ways. That flexibility is also something of a challenge in terms of articulating to later adopters, you know, what Hadoop is for, and particularly where it fits in the existing data management landscape. And I think, you know, it does have the potential to lead to confusion, and that, you know, in its worst case scenario, has the potential to lead to disillusionment. So I think it's a good question for people to keep asking themselves and for organizations to keep asking of Hadoop. Of course, there is no easy answer because each user and each vendor kind of has their own perspective on Hadoop's role. You know, when I think about this, I'm often reminded of the story of the blind men and the elephant, not just because of the elephant motif, of course, but how many people here would say they know the story of the blind men and the elephant? A fair few. So for those that don't, it's apparently actually, it's one of those stories that's in kind of every major religious text. There is a version of this story, and it basically involves, you know, a king or a wise man or, you know, the village leader gathering together 6 blind people and asking them to touch an elephant and describe what it is they think they're touching. You know, each to their own. I guess this is pre-internet, so there was no Facebook, no Angry Birds. People had to do something to fill the time, so Touch the Elephant obviously was a popular game. Who knows? But anyway, the point is, of course, each person has a different part of the elephant they're touching. And so one guy's at one end, and he's got, you know, the tusk, and it's hard and it's pointed, and so he concludes it must be some kind of spear or weapon. Another guy gets the short straw, and he's down the other end, and he's got the tail, and it's kind of stringy and long but tough, and so he concludes it must be some kind of rope or pulley system or something like that. And then another guy's further down, and he's by the ear, and the ear is wafting and blowing air over him, so he concludes it must be some kind of fan, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Now, depending on which version of the story you might be reading, this either descends into a philosophical argument, a debate, or all-out war. You know, we'll stick at the first point, I think, but you know, the point being that everybody has a different perspective based on their position, their experience. You get the picture. So how does this relate to Hadoop in particular? Well, I think probably you all recognize this man, Larry Ellison. Now, I'm not suggesting in any way that Larry Ellison is blind to the potential of Hadoop. I wouldn't say that at all. But what I would say that he has a very specific perspective on the potential of Hadoop, and that perspective is based on the fact that he is a multi-billionaire based on his database business. So when Larry Ellison talks about Hadoop, this is a great quote he gave a couple of years ago. As you can see from his perspective, Hadoop is about pre-processing, filtering data that then you store in the Oracle database. And this is a really good quote because it also really neatly describes, and Larry Ellison is actually very good at this. If you look back in hindsight at the statements he makes, he's very good at describing Oracle's products very succinctly before they release them. And this very succinctly describes Oracle's big data appliance and what it's for. You know, when you first look at the specs of this, you think, oh, this is a big data processing and analytics appliance. Makes sense. But you drill into the details, and you see it's not quite like that. Actually, the Hadoop part of it only serves a certain role, and as Larry Ellison said, from his perspective, once you've filtered that data, the place for analyzing it is in the Oracle database. So Hadoop's role, as far as Oracle is concerned, is for that big data processing and integration of data into the existing data management infrastructure. Now, there's nothing wrong with that perspective. It's perfectly legitimate. You know, from our perspective, based on our research, it only actually serves kind of a proportion of the use cases for Hadoop. You know, obviously, there's multiple applications Hadoop can be used for, multiple kind of roles, but, you know, we really see it boiling down into these three kind of areas. There's big data storage, so the low-cost storage of data, and I'll go into these in more detail as we go along. Big data processing, so, you know, the processing, filtering of that data and integration with existing data management technologies, and then big data analytics, so the actual analytics of data natively in Hadoop. And we actually see, you know, that as being an actual process that a lot of organizations have gone through in terms of their adoption of Hadoop. And I'll talk about that. Before I do, though, you know, I'm talking here about big data, and as the first kind of speaker, it's my role, I guess, to define big data, because everybody wants to hear a definition of big data, don't you? Well, we see big data as being about the realization of greater business intelligence by storing, processing, and analyzing data that was previously ignored due to the limitations of existing technologies, due to the 3 V's, and I'm sure you could all just shout them out as they come up. I'm not going to go through them in any detail. It's volume, velocity, and variety. So I think everyone's in agreement on that now, but we think there's more going on here than just volume, velocity, and variety. We think the changes that are happening in the industry are driven more than just the nature of the data. We see the adoption of some of these new data management technologies also being driven by what users want to do with their data, rather than just the nature of the data itself. And that's what we have this concept we call total data, and that's what that's all about. The reason we have the Dutch national football team here is because total data is also partly inspired by total football, a new approach to playing soccer, which was invented back in the late 1960s right here in Amsterdam, and then was taken to the world, brought to the world's attention, if you like, during the 1970s by the Dutch national side. There are honestly, some correlations between total data and total football. I'm not going to go into them now, but you'll have to trust me on that. What we do say, though, is that total data is about making the most efficient use of new and existing data management technologies. And it's not a replacement for big data. We're not saying use total instead of big. You know, what we say is if your data is big, the way you manage that should be total. So another way of looking at that is if volume, variety, and velocity is driving the adoption of big data technologies, for want of a better phrase, things like Hadoop, in-memory databases, machine learning, etc., and there's more than we can display here. If that's being driven from the inside out by the data requirements, then we also see total data driving adoption from the outside in based on what, as I said, the user wants to do with that data. And there's 4 key points that I'll go into in detail of what we see happening there. But importantly, it's also about the management of those technologies alongside the existing data management technologies. So things like master data management, data quality, existing relational databases, those don't get thrown away. It's about managing the entire data management ecosystem. But to go into detail on those 4 key aspects of total data, and actually to put Hadoop into perspective on those. So the first of them we see is totality. So totality is about the desire amongst organizations to store and process data in its entirety rather than deal with kind of samples of data and then extrapolate the results. One of the key examples I usually give here is actually eBay, because they have this approach to basically store and process everything they can and not throw any data away. But I know they're talking tomorrow, so I won't talk about them. But another good example, it's not always about storing and processing everything, but often it's about storing and processing data that you previously threw away. So a great example of that comes from Orbitz. Now, Orbitz is an online travel firm. Some of you may have used the service to get your tickets to travel here today. Prior to adopting Hadoop, they only had transactional and summarized non-transactional data in their data warehouse. So despite being completely reliant on their online business, they were actually throwing away the vast majority of their weblog data. And this, kind of now, even now, a couple of years later, seems kind of crazy that they would do that. But a lot of companies did, and a lot of companies still do. And the reason they do is that the data is not considered valuable enough to store in the data warehouse. It costs money to store data in the data warehouse. And if the data, you can't perceive the value of that data, you're not going to store it in the data warehouse. Hadoop changes the picture. It changes the cost model of storing data. It's now more, we're now able to store data that was previously thrown away because it gives a different platform for storing that data and a more efficient platform for storing that data. So now Orbitz are using Hadoop. They're using it to process the hundreds of gigabytes of log data produced by the millions of searches and transactions performed on its site each day. So they fulfilled this first role here, big data storage, low-cost storage of data. They're also processing that data and creating exports to R, and also aggregating the data and exporting it, into their existing data warehouse for analysis there. So the processing of the data and the integration into the existing data management landscape. The second aspect we talk about is exploration. So this is more about how users, as I say, want to engage with their data. So exploratory analysis, discovery in data sets, rather than asking the questions you already know you want to ask. And this is where we get the key difference between the data warehouse approach to data warehousing and approaches to Hadoop and what you want to do with that data. So, with a traditional data warehouse, you have the schema on write approach, as I'm sure many of you are aware here. The application produces the data. It's stored in the relational database based on a schema that you define in advance. And that's very, very efficient at answering the queries that you knew you wanted to ask when you defined the schema. It's very inefficient when your business changes, you want to ask new questions. And this is one of the, the problems we've seen over and over again over the recent years with the data warehouse, that it becomes very quickly very inefficient as businesses change, as strategies change, as they enter into M&A. Hadoop, on the other hand, and it's not the only technology that does this, but it's a prime example, uses a schema on read approach. Well, you store your data in Hadoop, and then the schema is generated when you do the query. It's not necessarily the most efficient way to go about an individual query, but it is extremely flexible and enables companies to respond to business change and ask different questions as and when they come up. Again, Orbitz is a fantastic example of this. So one of the first analytics projects they entered into was they wanted to perform analysis on customer data in order to create geo-targeted advertising. And actually, all the data they needed to do this was already in their data warehouse. So they knew who their customers were. They knew where they lived. They knew how to contact them. They knew, theoretically, they could write a query that could figure out what kind of offers they might be interested in and that they could send them. But writing a query and getting it to run efficiently very different things. And because they were asking it from a geographic perspective, which is not how the data had been, not how the schema had been applied, they found that the query was extremely inefficient, and it was actually reducing the ability to use the warehouse to do other things that they wanted to use the warehouse for every other day. So the approach that they took was to extract that data, move it into Hadoop, and then run their queries on that data there using MapReduce, and then so a much more efficient means of querying that data in a way that the data warehouse not only had never been designed for, but was actually restricting their ability to query the data from that perspective. So you see this process that they went through here, from big data storage, processing and integration into the wider landscape, and then into actual analytics on Hadoop itself. And I mentioned this is an adoption process that we see happening in lots of organizations. Actually, we've seen this happening, if we look at some of the very early adopters in the space, some of the innovators in this space as well. If you look back to 2003 and kind of the start of it all, the publication of the Google File System research paper, that was essentially all about large-scale distributed data storage of large volumes of data. Fast forward a year, and we have the Google MapReduce paper, which is all about large-scale distributed processing of data and integration into other existing Google analytics technologies. Then fast forward a few more years, and obviously, clearly, I'm simplifying here, but then you get some of these advanced native Hadoop analytics technologies. Sorry, not Hadoop, obviously, but Google MapReduce analytics technologies that are now shaping some of the emerging projects that we see around Hadoop. And so it's, my premise is that it's this process that enabled the innovators to go from something, Hadoop was something, and Google File System here was something they were creating, to something that they were actually using to shape their business, and they had adopted as part of their business strategy. Now, obviously, I've kind of borrowed and modified the chart here from Crossing the Chasm, and it's my premise as well that this process is one that will enable Hadoop to cross the chasm from those early adopters to the early majority and late majority as well. And the reason we see that, is I talked about Hadoop being a low-cost storage option, and that's a perfectly valid use case for Hadoop, but it's not really using Hadoop to its full potential. And if Hadoop is only used for that, it will be quite successful, but it won't make that jump across the chasm. Again, processing of data in Hadoop and then integration into the existing data management landscape, greater value for those using it, but for my money, it's not going to be the step that enables Hadoop to really transfer into that early majority. So Hadoop-based analytics, really unlocks that value, as we've discussed, of data that was previously ignored, and I think it will be key to Hadoop crossing the chasm over into the early majority. Now, an important point here is that when we talk to a lot of companies that are in this, the early majority, later majority stage, and they're looking at Hadoop, they see the really interesting analytics projects that are going on at some of the web properties that Herb mentioned. And there's a temptation to jump straight to analytics, to try and do it all at once. And, my view is that is potentially dangerous, because it runs the risk of creating, just another set of data silos that aren't properly integrated with the rest of the landscape. And that, has the potential to result in disillusionment, which could limit the ability for Hadoop to cross that chasm and to gain more widespread adoption. So back to total data, we're nearly there in terms of explaining these 4 points. So frequency is the third. So if velocity in the big data concept is about the rate at which data comes into an organization, or the rate at which data is produced by an organization, then frequency is the other side of the coin. This is about the rate at which companies want to analyze their data. And we see increasingly companies want to analyze their data more frequently to get a more up-to-date view of where they are, and with the idea that that will create more accurate business intelligence. A good example of this comes from YP. So YP is formed by the merger of AT&T Advertising Solutions and AT&T Interactive. And they were faced with the problem of increasing volume of traffic coming through their data distribution, through their distribution network. And it was coming in through multiple applications which had multiple databases. They wanted to provide intraday reporting on that data coming in to see where they were, how they were serving their customers. But they faced days of report lag due to dealing with those multiple databases. So, it doesn't take much to see if it takes more than a day to run a report, it's very difficult to move to running multiple reports a day. So clearly something had to give. And the solution they came to, as you may have guessed, was moving that data processing to Hadoop, which gave them a common data layer for all those applications in order to get more efficient processing of the data coming in through those applications. Now, we hear a lot of talk about, especially recently, in the last few months, about Hadoop and real-time. Is Hadoop a platform for real-time data processing? And I'm not going to answer that here, but I think this is an important point about frequency of analysis, and improving the frequency of analysis doesn't necessarily mean about moving to real-time. And here, they reduced their report lag to hours rather than days, but it unlocked some value in that data. It enabled them to move to more frequent analysis of that data, which enabled them to generate more business insight and have a better service of their customers by being better aware of how they were serving them at any given point in time. He's stuck. There we are. The fourth point is dependency. This is a little bit different. This is all about the fact that, yes, we see all these drivers for new data processing technologies, but we have to acknowledge the fact that there's, this huge investment that's out there in existing data management technologies, in SQL tools, and particularly in people, and in the training of people and analysts and administrators to use these technologies. And companies obviously want to balance an investment in the new with that investment in the old. And that's really what we see as driving, the huge attention we've seen in recent weeks around SQL and Hadoop, and the coming together of SQL and Hadoop. And I just wanted to touch on that briefly to talk about the different ways in which we see that happening, because there's a great temptation, I think, to lump all these things together and start comparing kind of apples and oranges. So we see it as breaking down into three main areas. There's SQL on Hadoop itself, SQL on data in an HDFS and HBase, and obviously Hive is the primary way in which people are doing that today. Hortonworks making a major investment in Project Stinger and Apache Tez in terms of improving the efficiency of Hive. Other companies taking different approaches. Cloudera obviously going with Impala, Apache Drill from multiple companies, but the primary one being Mapr. Phoenix is actually something coming out of Salesforce.com, and obviously if you're using cascading, then you'd probably be interested in Lingwars. But there's various different approaches, but it's basically about improving the efficiency of SQL analysis on data in Hadoop itself. The second group here is about bringing SQL analysis to data in Hadoop by bringing the relational database and locating it in the same environment, either on the same nodes or as close as you can get. So the primary vendor we've seen in this space over the years has been Hadapt, definitely a pioneer in this space. Teradata with Asta SQLH doing some interesting things, also in partnership even, with Hortonworks, Rainstore doing a similar thing. And then obviously in recent weeks a lot more attention because EMC making a lot of noise around Greenplum Hawk. Citus Data, a new startup in this space, and another one I just spoke to the other day called Jethro Data, looking to do effectively the same thing. And some of the big players as well also playing in this space. So Microsoft with their Polybase project, and IBM with something, not entirely sure what it is, but it's called Big SQL. We know that, and they'll be revealing more about that, I think, in the coming weeks. So those two kind of buckets are all about analytics, SQL analytics and Hadoop. The third area, just to separate out, is more about operational and transactional data processing on SQL-based data processing on Hadoop. And so two main players there, Drawn to Scale and Splice Machine. So, our view is that you can't necessarily lump all these things together and start comparing them. You have to think about the different approaches that are being taken and what they are 4. What they have in common, of course, other than obviously being about SQL and Hadoop, is they are about enabling Hadoop to cross the chasm by bringing that those SQL skills and that army of analysts and administrators and getting them to work on Hadoop. So I talked before about this approach to crossing the chasm and the role that this storage processing and analytics can play in that. There's obviously some other key metrics that we can look at, and I'll just finish off by looking at those in terms of the project itself. The maturity of the project, the ecosystem around the project, the interest from end users in the project, and particularly the geographic expansion of that interest. So in terms of the maturity of the project, I mean, clearly, Hadoop has been around a long time. We're looking at 7 years, more than 7 years now, and the project itself, the Hadoop core, has matured over that time. As you can see there, the red line at the bottom here. But also, we've seen over the years the addition of a number of new projects, either emerging from within Apache itself, or others being brought into the Apache ecosystem from other vendors. And that, has clearly even accelerated the growth of the project, has accelerated the growth of the code base, especially over the last kind of 2 years or so. Also, if we look at the vendor ecosystem, we've seen that change over the last couple of years. But if you look at this, so this is an illustration of the proportion so the number of individual contributors and the proportion that can be traced to individual companies. As you can see, the caveat being this is by their current employer, not necessarily the employer they were at when they contributed the code. But it's just one way of looking at it. So as you can see here, we see Hortonworks, there, Cloudera, Yahoo, Facebook. And the significant thing that I think we see there, and we see this if we add in the other projects that we listed on the previous slide as well, a similar picture, is the strength in depth in terms of the commitment of those 4 key players. I think that's really important when we look at Hadoop, is that the depth of commitment among those players, both vendors and obviously what we would consider kind of traditionally users of technology. The other important thing, though, is you see here, we've broken it out as the rest, 29% and 31%, and that actually illustrates the breadth of commitment here as well. So in terms of the Hadoop core, we see that relates to 70 different companies and over 200 different individuals contributing to the Hadoop core. And in terms of that wider set of Hadoop projects, over 120 different companies and 750 different individuals. So when we look at Hadoop, and we've done a lot of work over the years looking at open source communities, open source projects, I think, if you put these two things together, there is real good a sign of strength here in terms of the Apache Hadoop projects, in terms of both the strength of commitment from individual vendors and users, and also that breadth of commitment across the board. Another way of looking at that is if we divide these players up into different types. So you can see, yes, this is slightly dominated by vendors. 51% of the contributors at the moment work for or employed by vendors. But also, 38% of the code has been contributed by companies that we would consider to be users. So another good sign of a very healthy ecosystem. I think one area that we would see, perhaps could be improved upon, and I think will be improved upon, is this 6%, so for other vendors. So those are vendors that aren't, Hadoop distributors or supporters, but, part of that wider ecosystem that Herb talked about earlier. But, perhaps there is, you could say, an opportunity for them to contribute more in terms of Hadoop and actually further accelerate the maturity of the code. And I do believe we will see that now moving forward. And this will be interesting to compare this perhaps in a couple of years. So mainstream interest in Hadoop, certainly it's growing. And this is a quick chart. You see this a lot from Indeed.com. The growth of job postings, the people looking specifically for Hadoop skills. Always important, I think, with these charts to put it in some kind of context. So if we do that, compare with data warehouse, you can see, obviously, still some way behind, as you'd expect. But look at, the decline in companies advertising for people with data warehouse skills specifically, compared to Hadoop over particularly the last 2 years. Another thing that we look at is you can search LinkedIn for certain terms. It gives a good indication of the interest in different technologies, but also which companies are employing people who have Hadoop in their profiles. So as you can see here, we did this first back in August 2012, and at that point, so almost 3% of the people with Hadoop on their profiles actually worked at Yahoo. So a great indication of the commitment of Yahoo here. But also you see some interesting names in here, both from the user and the vendor side. We jump forward to February now this year. Yahoo has dropped down nearer to 2%, not because Yahoo has changed its commitment to Hadoop, but because the wider ecosystem have increased their commitment to Hadoop. And so that decline is actually, I'd say, a sign of it's a healthy sign of the adoption of Hadoop is growing. And the other thing I'd say, looking at this list, it's another healthy sign is for the first time now, there's no Hadoop distributors in this list. So again, the adoption of Hadoop skills is growing across a wider user base, not just within the vendor base. The other thing you can do with LinkedIn that we like to play around with is look at the geographic spread of the people with particular technology in their profile. So you can see not just who says they use Hadoop, but also where they reside. And so we did this first back in December 2011. And at first it looks like quite a decent spread until you put in the Bay Area. And this is a sign of a not particularly healthy state of affairs. As you can see here, over 28% of people with Hadoop in their LinkedIn profiles actually in that. It is a relatively small area, although people from there may not think it is. It is a relatively small area of the planet. But if we jump forward, so now August 2012, you see that now coming down slightly, under 25%. And then into February 2013, we ran this search again and coming down to under 23%. And a significant growth here, obviously in India and China, and to a lesser extent in places like the UK and actually the east coast of the US. And again, I believe that if we look at this again later in the year and into next year, I think we'll begin to see some of the other areas cropping up, particularly in Europe. I think obviously the Bay Area dominates, but we are seeing growth in other areas across into Europe, and I think that will begin to have an impact there in terms of the top 10. Another way to look at that, and this gives a better impression of the difference between the US and the rest of the world. So back in December 2011, there we go, 10,000 people on LinkedIn with Hadoop in their profile. Just under 36% were not in the US. August 2012, over 22,000 people, now just under 40% not in the US. And February 2013, getting towards 40,000 people and towards 42% of which not in the US. So, this is, again, another sign of a maturation, I think, of Hadoop adoption. And it is the fact that the trend is going that way is definitely a healthier sign. I think it could accelerate a little bit quicker, but it definitely is heading in the right direction. So just to sum up, this is just a run through of some of the different areas that we see Hadoop playing, where we see Hadoop role within the enterprise. As I said, just to highlight some of the key points again, Hadoop's greatest asset, as we see it, is its flexibility. But that is also a challenge, and I think especially for later adopters, it has the potential to lead to confusion and disillusionment, and it is something just to be slightly cautious of. That said, Hadoop is enabling greater business intelligence by storing, processing, and analyzing data that was previously ignored due to the limitations of previous data management and technology. So this is enabling new opportunities. It's enabling new business projects. I think that's one of the main reasons that we went heavily in terms of our coverage of Hadoop, because we could see that this isn't just about doing things differently, it's about doing things better and enabling new opportunities that companies never had before. That process of storing, processing, integrating, and analyzing data, we believe, as I said, is a process that has enabled the early adopters to understand Hadoop's role in the enterprise and in terms of their wider data management landscape. And you know, I believe, and I think we've seen some examples of this, that attempting to fast forward straight to analytics potentially has the end result that it creates data silos and it undermines the value of Hadoop and can potentially result in disillusionment. The Hadoop ecosystem is definitely a vibrant one, and you know, I think every data management player on the planet now has a Hadoop story. If not, they should be furiously working on one. It has great strength in depth in terms of the commitment of a few core vendors and core users, but also in terms of the breadth, in terms of that wider ecosystem, both on the vendor and the user side. And there is growing mainstream interest, there's no doubt about that. Geographic adoption is a little way behind, but it is growing as well, it is improving. And you know, we believe that means that Hadoop is well positioned to cross the chasm into mainstream adoption. So that's my perspective, anyway, on Hadoop's role. As I mentioned at the start, obviously one of the things about Hadoop is that everybody has a slightly different perspective on Hadoop's role. So I welcome you to come and argue with me or challenge me or just have a discussion with me about what I've said. I'll be here all day today and tomorrow, and looking forward to learning a lot more about different Hadoop deployment projects, etc., and having conversations with as many of you as we can. So please, you know, if you have anything to say in response, just stop me and it'd be great to talk to you. But for now, thank you very much.